new wave that we're talking about here this afternoon. So it'll be fun to dive right in. And by way of disclosure, I'll say that Horace, whoever you want, between us, he and I average 3.5 cars per household. So just to kick things off, why don't we maybe just go down just really briefly in just a minute. Can you just explain who you are, your organization, and what you do? And then we've got lots to discuss in a pretty limited amount of time.
Good afternoon. My name is Will Burns. I'm the Director of Government Partnerships for the East Coast for Spin, which was mentioned earlier. We're owned by Ford Motor Company. And prior to working for Spin, prior to being in the private sector, I was a member of the Illinois Legislature and a member of the Chicago City Council.
Hey everyone, my name is Tsui. I'm a co-founder and COO of Revel. So Revel right now is the largest shared electric vehicle operator in the US. So we focus on an electric moped, operate fleets in New York City, actually the only micromobility operator in New York City, in Washington, DC, in Austin, Miami, and Oakland. I say moped just to differentiate between a moped and a scooter. So a moped meaning a street legal Vespa-style electric scooter. So a vehicle that does not live in any sort of gray area, regulatory gray area or infrastructure gray area, ride and parks in the street. It's fully regulated by the Department of Motor Vehicles and comes with full third-party liability insurance for riders.
My name is Steyn. I'm the CEO of Bolt. My background is in automobiles. I spent several years at General Motors. And the mission of Bolt is really to provide micromobility as a service and link it to really the transportation grid. And we operate in the US and also in Europe.
Hi, I'm Marc Scribner. I'm a senior fellow at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. CEI is a free market research and advocacy organization here in Washington, D.C. And I cover transportation policy there and have for the past decade.
That's great. So I need a sense of who we are. Just give the panelists and myself a sense of where the crowd stands. So out of curiosity, how many of you, quick show of hands, have been on an e-scooter so far? Almost everyone. How many of you have been on an e-bike? How many of you own an e-bike? Or own an e-scooter? Nobody. Interesting. Okay. That's just to sort of to get the lay of the land. And then just to dive right in, I want this to be conversational, and I think we've got about 25 minutes for opening it right up. And just, we just heard, Horace is such an articulate booster of the micromobility space. So just, I think, to maybe just have things be interesting, I'll play devil's advocate. And please convince me why I'm wrong. When I say that, I just spoke with, on Friday, this is true, with a gentleman from the Los Angeles Department of Transportation who is deeply involved in managing micromobility there. It is the biggest deployment in the United States. And they have apparently about 1 million rides on micromobility per month. Now to put that in context, that's about 33,000 a day. And just like basic math suggests that there are about 6 million trips taken in Los Angeles just going to and from work in Los Angeles. So we're talking about a relative drop in the bucket. So my question to you all is micromobility really going to change how Americans move? Yeah, anywhere you want. Who wants to take it on? Say, why is this not just like an interesting new trend that's not going to be able to scale and make a huge difference?
I think it's going to depend on a set of push-pull factors. So I think governments have a role in terms of making sure that these companies have the ability to operate, and there's a cognizance of the costs that are involved in providing the service. And so revenue sharing models are efficient and make sense. Rules make sense. I also think that there needs to be a greater emphasis in cities upon enforcing parking rules, lowering speed limits on streets, creating more infrastructure, creating more sort of pushes that encourage people to no longer use cars for single occupancy vehicle trips. And then things obviously the federal government can do too, which we can talk about later. But I think a lot of it's going to be about policymakers sort of creating the environment for micromobility, but also pushing people away from the car towards other modes of transportation.
How big can this get? Yeah.
I'll jump in. I think actually there's a lot of truth in the fact that micromobility in the current form does not work. Right? I think it's, I, by the way, agree with everything that was said, that this is an industry that's going to be disruptive, but not in the form that it is today. And I think the biggest failure that micromobility currently has, and that's why it's not as significant, it is not connected to the rest of the transportation grids in the cities. And it's not regulated properly, and it's not safe. And coming from the automotive industry, it's kind of scary how it's right now, the micromobility 1.0 evolved. So I think we're going to be in a situation when the cities have to take a much bigger stance of what that means. Because right now, people are just saying that this is a toy, which in the current form, it is a toy. The products themselves are poorly manufactured, they last a couple of months, and you throw them in the river. It's a nuisance, right? It doesn't work. But the fact is that the micromobilities right now in different forms is the right solution for the last mile. It needs to move to that premise. And again, for that, it needs to be that it ties to the bigger transportation grid, and the municipalities and the cities take ownership of how that works.
Just to add one point here, to take the consumer perspective, if you look at why micromobility, in my opinion, has taken off, from a demand perspective, from a use case perspective, it's really two reasons. One, the price is right. From a standpoint of comparing what someone used to pay, the price of a car, the price of a rideshare trip. One thing we don't really talk about is the overall experience. The experience of being on this type of vehicle, being on city streets. I think it's clear that consumers, there's a different element of enjoyment that's hard to put a price on. I think that's why if you look at the price of scooters in many markets right now, it's up towards 33, 35 cents a minute. If you take a step back and you look at the price of car share in many markets, even though you have some car shares pulling out, it was 41 cents a minute. So how is it possible that you can have a small kick scooter device that costs a tenth of the cost of a car, yet a consumer is willing to pay almost the same price per mile? So I think there's an element that you have to think about in terms of the overall experience you're providing to someone that's more than just the overall economic utility.
And in your framing, in terms of, is this going to make a huge impact on the typical American? If that's the question, I would say I'm a skeptic. In part for the demographic reasons, even with a year-over-year doubling, we're still talking about perhaps 2/100ths of 1% of total U.S. person trips taken annually. That's the current market today. And also, part of it is where these are best able to be deployed. And that's in cities, and cities, dense urban cores, tend to have a strong regulatory impulse. So part of my skepticism, I think these obviously you're going to see, you could see much more use in cities, but the vast majority of Americans are likely to continue living in the suburbs in the decades to come, where this isn't as well suited. Certain household characteristics may be going in favor, smaller households, things like that, fewer kids. But in terms of your average American, I think the impact is likely to be low. But for certain segments of the American public, particularly those who live in these dense urban cores, I think there's promise. And then you're running into both some of the technological issues, we're at 1.0 now, but these regulatory issues. How can you convince city officials not to just ban them?
So you think regulation is the existential threat?
I think for the places, yeah. For the place where it could work, I mean, it depends how you frame the question, but yes.
Julia, you're smirking. I don't think you agree necessarily.
I don't. I think the regulation needs to come. Because again, when you think about also coming back to the historical revisions, there were multiple evolutions of regulations of the cars. There's multiple evolutions of the regulations of the infrastructure. And so again, everybody at the cities right now shun the micromobility because people think it's going to go away. But in reality, again, there's no other solution for the last 50 yards and the last mile. So it is here to stay for also all the reasons that we discussed earlier. But it needs to be run in a similar way how people thinking about running the bus business. And why not link the micromobility to actually the buses? Why not have a better prescription on the parking rules? Why not having the scooters or e-bikes or everything else linked to the grid? And then the cities can choose what product actually they want and who operates them, instead of doing permits right now.
Well, you've made reference a couple of times to something I wanted to ask about, which is this idea of the first mile, last mile, which comes up a lot in talk about micromobility. This is the idea that micromobility can help people get to and from that last mile to a public transportation station. Lots of studies show people don't like walking more than a quarter mile or maybe half a mile to or from a station. So let me ask you this. I think it was you, Paul, who mentioned the cost of these devices, which can be, I believe, the last I checked, just as an example, murders in Los Angeles is 39 cents a minute plus a $1 unlock fee. So if you're taking a 10-minute trip, you're at almost $5. And that's on so if it's a 10-minute trip, let's say you're a mile, maybe a mile and a half to a transit stop in Los Angeles, are we really expecting people to pay $5 on top of a transit trip, twice a day to commute? Is this actually a first mile, last mile scalable solution, at least in the shared model?
I think it'll really depend on the market. I think it's important that the way that Forrest opened up by saying that micromobility is more than just scooters. I think we have a tendency to think about micromobility being simply last mile transportation, but it's much more than that. It's when you think about the true unbundling of the car, you think about operating across the 5
So
cities.
you're saying beyond first mile, last mile, period.
Yeah.
That's fine, but I actually want to hit this point because it comes up a lot where people talk about, this is one of those halo effects around micromobility. They can have people get to and from public transportation. And to me, this is a genuine question. With the current pricing levels in the United States, is that actually a scalable solution? I mean, you work a lot with transit agencies, you have thoughts?
I mean, I think for right now, I think it's scalable. I think that it also depends on what cities are willing to do to push people out of cars. And I think in a lot of big cities, it's very expensive to park in certain locations. It's very expensive to use a car, and so you're looking for other ways to get around. And so right now, if you're talking about a hot summer day in DC, and I've got to get from downtown to the one part of downtown to the Wilson building, and I'm in a suit, I'm taking a scooter. It's worth it to me to show up not being drenched in sweat. And so I think, look, there are lots of places where people need these kinds of alternatives, and they need them, and they're using them, and I think that we have to continue to create the environment to reduce our subsidies for cars and car travel.
I think it also goes back to a little bit of how our cities are designed. If you look at Washington, D.C. or New York City, you have your transportation infrastructure that's primarily geared to get you in and out of one location, in and out of Midtown Manhattan, or in and out of the central core of D.C. But as you look at, take a city like New York, now in the outer boroughs where no one used to work, everyone would commute into Manhattan. Now over 80% of new jobs are actually created, or people that live in Brooklyn and Queens also work in Brooklyn and Queens. So you look at how people are accessing new jobs, accessing new locations, it isn't always through new infrastructure.
Hey, do you want to around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there could be some infrastructure support, although I would still be skeptical because over the last decade, we've seen a build out of dedicated bike lanes, and this isn't to say anything bad about them, but that has not coincided with a rising share of cycling trips. And I think that we need to think carefully about these things before we start locking in generation one technology, lavishing that with subsidies, developing specialized infrastructure that may not in fact suit long-term travel demand from the public. And that's who really we should be concerned about as the consumers.
So for those of you, 3 or 4 of you represent providers in micromobility, just to get a sense of who's actually, let's understand a little more about what trips are actually being taken for. Do you have data from your own companies about what trips are being replaced? Whether it could be trips are taken on foot, there's some evidence that happens too, versus those that are by car or by ride hail. I'm interested, or are they induced trips that effectively wouldn't have happened at all previously because they're joyrides, something like that. What are you seeing?
The sense is that it's taking rides away from rideshare. The people who might have used Uber or Lyft to get somewhere instead opt to use a scooter. That's what we're finding.
Predominantly others?
Yeah, so for us, it was interesting hearing the statistic where the average occupancy of a car is 1.2. So 20% of our rides are actually 2 riders. So the average occupancy of a Revel moped is 2, or 1.2, so it's the same. So talking to our users, there's 2 statistics that we really
And
know.
to be clear, that's safe. You actually allow people to have 2, as opposed to the lime scooters that I just saw this morning. People
They're built for 2 riders. They have 2 helmets. They're built for 2.
great to hear.
So across all of our markets, our average trip is 3 miles. We also know from user surveys that the mode share or the mode shift, anywhere from 50 to 60% of all of our rides are directly replacing a car trip. The primary sort of shift there being rideshare.
It's a combination of all of that, but I'm a little skeptical about sort of the validity of this data in Micromobility 1.0, just because, again, every city has the geofencing, and what it's protecting right now is a ton of private property and some of the areas where, frankly, Micromobility could work as a solution.
What do you mean by the geofencing? Just when you say every city has the geofencing?
Geofencing, right, and I think people who kind of dealt with micromobility closer, it's basically as part of the permit, the city tells you where you can operate. And so some of the actually places where micromobility could be a fantastic solution for tourism or frankly getting to the jobs are cut off because again we're stuck in this vortex of the cities don't know what to do with micromobility and they don't want to annoy people because it's annoying people.
Well, now it sounds like you do agree with Mark, there should be less regulation.
No, but I think it needs to be a smart regulation, right? And I think it needs to be, again, much more thoughtful how it fits into the overall picture and its citizens, right? So I think right now a lot of the trips, either the ride sharing or the joy rides, and again, it depends on the geography
Right.
and the geofencing of it. So I don't know that we fully understand the capability. Because again, the micromobility 1.0 is really not working very well, neither with private enterprises nor with the city transportation grid. And that's, I think, where the next frontier has to come to.
I would push back a little bit on that. At Spin, we've worked with private developers to install charging stations, we call them Spin hubs, on private properties so that you create an amenity for the residents of those buildings, and you also help cities reduce the amount of scooter clutter, and you reduce the number of vehicle mile trips traveled by our operations staff to charge vehicles and check on their maintenance. So I think we are trying to find innovative ways to work with cities to solve problems before they have to come up with a regulation to deal with it. And what we found in permit applications in a number of markets, especially in Florida that have come up recently, is that they are encouraging providers to provide that kind of amenity to a city, and it's an important factor that cities are looking at.
Yeah, just to jump in, I think in terms of the electrification grid, and again, at GM, I ran car sharing and I ran one of the largest fleets of electric vehicles, so I'm very familiar with the electrification and infrastructure development. I think the beauty of micromobility is, again, in the next version, to move away for the plugging of these things. I mean, right now it's a travesty what's happening with the plugins. When people take it homes, it's unsafe. It's like, it's not what you're supposed to do with these devices. It needs to have swappable batteries. It needs to evolve and will be better and better. And again, the infrastructure can be easily distributed.
That's happening, isn't
It is happening.
And that's actually in the private sector providers on interest
Exactly.
because it reduces the costs of having to go and collect the devices and recharge them.
Absolutely. And so I
It seems
think
like the market's solving it. No, is that a regulatory issue?
No, I think the market is solving it. And again, this is, I think, the first way of working with the private enterprises, but there are a lot more, right? That it has nothing to do with necessarily the city geofencing it, but when, again, the micromobility evolves and the product starts evolving, again, it takes away from like basically the skateboard and moving into something that can be delivered and can last longer and again, create value in society.
So we talked about the types of trips that are being replaced. I'm also interested in who's actually using these devices. Because I think there's a stereotype, which may be unfair, I'm curious your sense, that it's basically, 24-year-olds who are having fun on a Friday night, or it's tourists. Is that accurate? Is that inaccurate? What are you experiencing from your own ridership data? Any of you, go ahead.
I would just say that one of the markets where we operate right now, we're the only micromobility provider there, is Dayton, Ohio, which is not known for necessarily being a hipster destination. Notwithstanding that Oregon District is a great place to grab dinner if you happen to be there. But we've seen tremendous usage by everyday people who are looking for ways to move around the city. And it was not a market that people were originally excited about, but it has really performed quite well for them. So I think there are unmet needs, and I think that part of the experimentation in our industry is trying to see whether markets work, reaching out to communities, demonstrating the product, and working with them to make it happen.
How many of your riders, for example, are, if you have the data, over age 30? Do you know? Just curious, because this goes against the stereotype of
I think it depends on the city. I would say that for Bolt, again, in our operations last year, it's evenly distributed, like across the geographies. So in some places, like Florida, there's a lot of tourism. And so, yes, it does serve the need. But in some of the places around the country, it's really everyday that commutes.
I thought you were going to say in Florida you have a lot of elderly riders. I would have thought that too. You could have gone either way.
I don't know.
So Revel's a little bit different because it's a motor vehicle. So we actually check the driver's license of all new users that sign up. We check their driving history. We make sure they don't have a suspended license. We also put a minimum of 21 years of age. We've seen through, in terms of demographics, a lot of our ridership tends to mirror bike share. And the primary age demographic that we have right now is actually between 30 and 40. And I think that'll continue to improve and continue to change. especially if you look anywhere in the world, you look in Europe, Latin America, Asia, a moped or a Vespa, this type of scooter is literally the way the world likes to get around. You can go short trips, you can go long trips, and you see young, old, male, female on this type of vehicle. So we see no reason why that won't happen here. And it will continue to change as you have new form factors, you have 3 wheels instead of 2 wheels. You know, people ask me a lot of what is the barrier to getting on in terms of being able to ride a moped. And for me, it's lateral balance. If you can ride a bike, you can do this. But say you don't, that's when you start to get into just new types of devices and the approachability just gets better and better. But I also think it's incumbent on all operators to make sure that they're serving all communities. And that's why a lot of operators, ourselves included, have created access programs, serve entire communities. You know, us, we serve all 8 wards in DC, and we do so with a fleet that is very much not right-sized for that geographical area.
And to be fair, a lot of cities require to get a permit that you have a portion of your fleet deployed in low-income communities, right? Yeah. Well, I want to ask a couple questions about regulation, and we'll open it up. Since we're on the Hill, it feels appropriate. Horace earlier cited with apparent praise, I think, that Berlin, there's 30 operators, is that right? At least. So there's an argument that's a good thing. You have lots and lots of choice. Or I'll put it out there, there's an argument that's actually a bad thing. Because for a user experience, who really wants to have their phone out there, but they have to toggle back and forth to figure out which app will get them to the nearest scooter. So that's not a great user experience. And also, frankly, you can, if you have, say, 10,000 devices distributed over 4 companies instead of 30, you can have many more devices that per company, which actually improves the unit economics for providers. So I'm curious whether, so they're going to go either ways. Do you believe that for the biggest markets, the Los Angeleses, the Berlins, the Parises, the DCs for that matter, is it better to have more providers or to actually deliberately have government constrain the number of providers in the market?
We support having fewer providers in the market and larger scooter cabs. In part because it's harder for cities. Let me back up for a second. Julian mentioned geofences. One of the things at Spin that we pride ourselves on are doing the things that cities ask us to do. So we install the geofences. We have no ride zones, no park zones. So somebody who rides one of our scooters is going to actually comply with the city's regulations. There are other companies that may not install those geofences and abide by those regulations, and so they're able to gain revenue that we're not able to gain. If you have fewer providers, it makes it easier for the city to enforce the rules of the road. If the rules of the road are enforced across all companies, it's a fairer system for everybody. And so I support the idea of DC going from 9 permitted vendors to 4 permitted vendors and much larger fleet size. So we're going to go in DC from 720 scooters from the 2019 permit to 2,500 allowed here.
Yeah, for those who are following, DC did do this to limit the number of providers, but there's now been an appeals process that's going forward this quarter. What do others think to this question of whether it's better to have open with lots of providers or deliberately limit the numbers in the biggest markets? Marc,
I think the danger there is to see exactly what we saw in recent years with station-based bike share companies. That was all the rage a decade ago. We saw these being built out, public-private partnerships.
You mean like Capital Bike Share?
Like Capital Bike Share. What many of those cities did, they were locked into 5-10-year exclusive franchise contracts with that single firm. So when some of these startups that were dockless wanted to come in, the city aggressively enforced against those new competitors. So I think that's at least right, especially right now, this question of limiting the number of providers and vehicle caps and things like that, it worries me because we are at 1.0 in this, and if we're talking 2 years from now, we're going to see some amazing advances, and we're potentially locked. How long is that reviewed? I mean, those are the sort of questions you want to, or how often is that reviewed? Those are sort of the questions you want to ask to prevent the kind of technological lock-in that could actually backfire for the companies who may think they're benefiting from that cap, that basically government grant. It could prevent them from doing bigger type of things in the future.
So just to be clear, you think cities should have no caps whatsoever?
At this point, I think they need to recognize there are some serious risks about doing that.
About having a cap? About having
About
caps?
having a cap.
Interesting.
I agree more with Will's perspective here. I think that there needs to be some limit to the number of operators and the number of vehicles, but I also think it needs to be done in a very intelligent way. I think just to give our perspective and maybe a real world example on how it could harm an operator. So when we first started this company, we started small. We started with a small fleet of about 100 vehicles in New York City. So with 100 vehicles, you can only really cover so much area. But that was self-enforced. We wanted to learn. We wanted to start small. But when we went from 100 vehicles to 1,000 vehicles, we more than quadrupled our utilization, going from, say, 2 to 3 rides per vehicle, timesing that by 3 or 4. So if you look at just the value of what you can bring to citizens, the use cases that open up, if you don't operate with a certain level of scale and density, you're just setting yourself up for failure.
I think I'll be slightly contrarian to it. I think some of the cities should, and I think LA is somewhat on the right track in my opinion. They should consider running their own micromobility solution, because think about the benefits, how the common payment systems, it's like if you have a card that works in the subway, the card that works in the bus, and it works for the micromobility. That just opens up a completely new ballgame of what the citizens of the city can do.
Is LA, what is LA doing that aligns with that?
I think LA is thinking very much about kind of how the data for the rides is used and how to basically have a better view of the infrastructure of the city and
Oh,
work
sure, like
through
with the
it. So,
mobility data specification.
yeah,
Sure, they're not
mobility.
operating their own service.
but look, right now, the cities, look at the bus systems and the rail system and everything else. And again, this is very different kettle of fish, very traditional, et cetera, et cetera. But some cities choose to operate their own. Some cities actually outsource it, and there's competitive operators who come into it. But again, the city has a lot of say in what this looks like.
I feel like it's only fair, Horace, I let you weigh it. Do you have thoughts on whether Berlin is doing the right thing about having 30-plus providers, or if it should limit it?
It's a difficult question because I think that the German market is focused on, you know, a different form of regulation at the federal level versus at the local. Right? So you think about vehicles regulated very heavily at the top, and yet there's sort of an open free-for-all at the bottom. So I think the solution, by the way, I believe is in mobility as a service. So sort of some aggregator that comes in and provides some way to bundle, and if not sort of discover these services through a new interface. I don't think it's a question of right or wrong. I think it's simply one of the experiments that's underway to see what makes sense. And we'll see, the market shake out at some point, and we'll see the winner emerge.
Fair enough. It does seem like there's a trend in this country, both San Francisco and DC, which are two of the best micromobility markets in the US, have both deliberately limited the number of vendors in recent months, and both have gotten big protests as a result from the companies that didn't win. And Paris is about to do the same, which is another one of the biggest markets. So this is a trend, I think, to watch in 2020. Let me just have one or maybe two more questions, and we'll see what's on people's minds. But we're on Capitol Hill. We're talking a lot about city policy here, but what's the role, if any, of state government, or for that matter, federal government, in managing micromobility? And with that, before you answer, I'll just say with ride-hail, which was the last really disruptive big new mode that emerged very quickly with some encouragement, frankly, by the ride-hail companies, states took a leading role away from cities in regulating those devices, which has been an ongoing point of consternation with a lot of city officials. So with that history, what's the right approach at state halls and the federal level for micromobility?
So at Spin, unlike some of the other companies, we don't believe in preemption. So we believe the city should have the ability to come up with their own policies on regulating micromobility, because cities are very, very different. We oppose bills at the state level that call for preemption. We think the states should have pretty flexible legislation around defining what a scooter is, so that there's flexibility in case scooter sizes increase or we have different models. We can fit within the definition and not have to go back to the state capitol to change the law.
And a number of states have done that, like
Yeah.
Ohio's one, where it's just like, this is what a scooter is, go to it.
Exactly,
basically.
exactly. And then to give localities the ability to make
Right.
a decision on how to regulate. And there should be very few state standards and just let the cities figure it out. At the federal level, I think that the federal government needs to send signals through funding that transit's important. We need to look at ways we subsidize single occupancy vehicle trips in cars and look at scaling that back and investing in other modes of transportation that encourage people to use micromobility, like transit.
I think one of the things that we benefit from as an operator that I think if this happens, a lot of other operators can benefit from as well, is just regulatory clarity. From the standpoint that we can go to a state DMV, there's clear laws around what is a moped, how is it inspected, who can ride it, where can they ride it. That just makes operations that much easier. So if you look at maybe legislation that was introduced in New York that unfortunately didn't go through, it looked at amending sort of the vehicle code at a federal level that starts to really define these other forms of micromobility devices. Like one, you have more clarity at a state level, but then you also need consistency between states. I mean, one thing that I find really confusing is, and just take today for instance, I was at our warehouse, I saw a bird scooter, and on the side it said, don't ride on sidewalks. But then if you look in Florida, it's actually illegal at the state level to ride a kick scooter on the road. So there's so much confusion between states, so just continuing to increase that level of clarity just makes operations and providing the service actually realistic.
That's a good example.
I agree with the position that it should be a local matter because every city is very different and infrastructure grid is very different. And so I wholeheartedly agree with Will's position on that.
Just to be clear, this is not a theoretical argument. There was a bill introduced in California, AB 1112, last year that would have standardized and limited actually a lot of the abilities of local governments to regulate micromobility in ways that they want. That didn't end up passing, but it may come back. Sorry, Mark, I'm sure you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, and on the state question, I'm more in line with everyone. I'd be cautious about preemption given these vehicle types. I think the argument was much stronger when you're talking about ride hailing. Conventional motor vehicles traveling at high speeds, they're going to easily cross jurisdictional boundaries going between municipalities and counties. So I don't see that here. At the federal level, not sure there's a whole lot to be done other than I think just like at the states, they should be thinking about this. Feds, they should be thinking about this. Perhaps if there's for scooters specifically, if there is a case to be made for safety regulation, what used to be Underwriters Laboratories, UL now has a standard 2272, and this came following the hit hoverboard of the 2015 Christmas season that also had some fire safety issues. So this is meant to address some of those fire safety issues from the electrical systems. Maybe that's something, I'm not endorsing incorporate the Consumer Product Safety Commission incorporating that standard into regulation. But those are kind of the things, smaller things like that I think would be worth thinking about longer term. I think light touch overall, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just throw it. I'm curious. For those of you who follow what the Federal Transit Administration is doing, there have been two very small grant programs. First was MOD Sandbox 3 years ago, but now there's been two others. I think they're called IMI and AIM that have been announced around $10 million each that give transit agencies a chance to compete